The Catholic Church is made up of 24 different particular churches, including Latin, Coptic, Russian Greek, Ethiopian, Armenian, Maronite, and so many more. But what exactly does that mean? The Catholic Church is supposed to be one universal church, right? But if that's the case, then why are there 24 different particular churches within it? What's the difference between someone who's part of the Latin liturgical rite and someone who's part of maybe the Hungarian Greek Rite? Or any other rites for that matter? Do all of these churches and liturgical rites really follow and believe the same things? Well, let's find out. Hello and welcome to Saints and Skeptics. This is a podcast where we discuss common questions about the Catholic faith, the history of the church, the lives of saints and church doctors. We'll talk about theology, philosophy, and a whole lot more. My name is Michael Ryan. I'm incredibly grateful that you've joined us today. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the particular churches and liturgical rites that are found within the confines of the Catholic Church. And I can't speak for you, of course, but when I first heard that there are not one or two or something like that, but 24 different, primarily self-governing churches within the Catholic Church, I had a lot of questions. It seemed wrong, I guess I would say, foreign to me to think that the Catholic Church, which is, again, one universal church, is actually made up of 24 of these different churches, all within their own different liturgical rites. So, as I tend to do when I'm confused or have questions, I went searching for answers. So the main objective of today's episode is to talk about what I found during my research and, more importantly, maybe where that research has led me. So I'm going to touch on each of these 24 different particular churches, give a little bit of information about how and when they got started, talk about why they even exist in the first place, like why they're there, how the church is still universal, even though this could come across as being fragmented, and we're going to touch on a lot more as well. So with all of that being said, let's get started. And I think a good place to probably start is with the question, what is a liturgical rite? Well, a liturgical rite is the specific manner of celebrating the sacraments. So this would include things like the liturgy's prayers, the gestures that are made, the vestments that are worn, maybe the church calendar, etc. Right? Okay, so that's a liturgical rite, but what's a particular church? Well, the particular church is the church itself, and by that I mean the community of faithful members that in turn make up that church. So maybe another way of saying it is that the term particular church refers to an institution, and the term liturgical rite refers to the ritual practices of said institution. So as of 2025, when this is being recorded, there are 24 different particular churches, and there are 6 main liturgical rites that these 24 different churches utilize. These particular churches are then separated into being Eastern and Western churches, with there currently being 23 of the 24 as Eastern churches and 1 Western church. And as you may have guessed, that one Western church is the Latin Church, which follows the Roman or Latin Rite. So this is what we know more frequently as the Roman Catholic Church. And this is also the largest particular church and the largest liturgical rite by a long shot. There are approximately, last time I checked, around 1.4 billion or so members, Catholics, worldwide, and 1.3 billion of that 1.4 belong to the Roman or Latin Rite, the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so that's the Latin Rite. Right, that's one of the 6 different liturgical rites, but what are the other 5? Well, in no particular order, they include the West Syriac Rite, the East Syriac Rite, the Armenian Rite, the Alexandrian Rite, and the Byzantine Rite. So, just to be very technical here, there are additional liturgical rites out there, but these 6 are the major ones, and they make up 99% or more, probably. It's more like 99.9 of all Catholics, which is why these are the ones that I'm focusing on in today's episode. Okay, Now, what particular churches fall under what liturgical rite? Because if you remember, the liturgical rite is the ritual practices, but the particular church is the church itself, the community of faithful members, the institution. So there's multiple particular churches that fall under each liturgical rite. Hence why there's only 6 liturgical rites, but there's 24 particular churches. So I'll just take it one by one, I suppose, going through each liturgical rite. So under the West Syriac Rite, you have the Maronite Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, and the Syro-Malankar Catholic Church. Under the East Syriac Rite, you have the Chaldean Catholic Church and the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. Under the Armenian Rite, you have the Armenian Catholic Church. Under the Alexandrian Rite, you have the Coptic Catholic Church, the Eritrean Catholic Church, and the Ethiopian Catholic Church. And last, but certainly not least, because this is kind of the largest rite, at least in terms of particular churches, is the Byzantine Rite. And this is a mouthful, but here we go. We have the Albanian Greek Catholic Church, the Belarusian Greek Catholic Church, the Bulgarian Greek Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic Church of Croatia and Serbia, the Greek Byzantine Catholic Church, the Hungarian Greek Catholic Church, the Italo-Albanian Catholic Church, the Macedonian Greek Catholic Church, the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, the Romanian Greek Catholic Church, the Russian Greek Catholic Church, the Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church, the Slovak Greek Catholic Church, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Whew! Did you catch all that? All right. So that is a very broad intro into what we're dealing with here. So let me take a second to break down each of those one by one. And we'll start with the liturgical rites themselves, and then I'll briefly talk about each different particular church that fall under those rites. Also, as you probably noticed, there's a ton of information here regarding these liturgical rites in particular churches. It's easy to get lost in it. And unless I wanted this episode to be, 5 hours long, there's just no way that I can go into a ton of depth about each of these, but I will do my best to give them justice in the time that we have. So oftentimes I find that when discussing topics like this, especially things that are a little bit more dense with information or difficult to wade through, it helps me a lot to start at the very beginning, or at least as far back as I can find. And in our situation here, that beginning is around the time of Jesus. So specifically around the time of his death. As many of you probably know, before his death, Jesus tasked his disciples with going out into the world and spreading the word of God to all nations and peoples. We still are supposed to follow this mission to this day. And luckily for all of us, his disciples took that very literally. His apostles and disciples took his teachings, the very beginnings of Christianity, and they spread it as far and as wide as they possibly could. So as a church and as a community of faith, we, again, continue to try to do this every day in any way that we can. Following the death of our Lord Jesus Christ, his teachings began to spread to local churches in a wide range of areas, but some of these included places like Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Mesopotamia, Constantinople, Armenia, etc. That area surrounding where he lived his earthly life, of course, is where things first began to spread. And these areas each developed their own stable liturgical families, if you will. So there was no phone, there's no email, there's no social media, there's nothing like that to communicate back and forth during that time. So it took a lot longer for information to be spread and shared. This way, making it easier for each of these different liturgical families to develop in their own way. They developed in these different regions that were spread throughout the world, but they developed simultaneously, but also individually. As time went forward, the church later grouped them kind of roughly as Latin, Byzantine, Alexandrian, Armenian, West Syriac, and East Syriac. So that's where these different liturgical families or rites that we have today come from. Then, if we continue to break this down even further, the same pattern of distinct communities that are using their own languages and heritage and local churches to form these liturgical families is also what led to the creation of the particular churches that we see today. So each region may have followed a certain liturgical family, right? But the regions were really, really large. So subregions or specific communities or groups of people then formed certain particular churches that fell under the umbrella of said liturgical family, right? So just to give you an example, when you're thinking about how large these areas are, if you're talking about, let's just say the West Syriac Rite, right? That's a liturgical rite that we have. They have the Maronite Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, and the Syro-Malankar Catholic Church. The countries that fell underneath that West Syriac liturgical rite were vast and spread relatively far apart. It was a lot of places like Jordan, Turkey, Israel, Syria, etc. And since, again, they couldn't really communicate incredibly easily back then, they could travel and write to each other, etc., but they weren't able to pick up the phone and call. They were developing their own communities as time went forward. Just as you kind of see communities develop on their own today. Now, we're a lot more interconnected, but I'm hoping that, you can kind of get the point. So let's break each of these liturgical rites or families down one by one. And I'm going to just talk on each one, but just briefly, just in the interest of time, right? And so, as I mentioned before, there's currently estimated to be somewhere around 1.4-ish billion Catholics in the world, which, side note, that's incredible. Go Catholics. And 1.3 or so billion of them belong to the Latin Rite and its particular church, aka the Roman Catholic Church, myself included, actually. And I'm sure a lot of you listening probably fall under that same category. So let's just start there. So the Latin liturgical tradition is actually pretty interesting because it has several, I don't know what you would, sub-rites maybe you would call it underneath it. I don't think they actually call them sub-rites. They're just referred to as rites, but it's easier for my brain to understand it as being a sub-rite under the Roman Rite itself. And what I mean by that is this is things like the normative or ordinary form of the Mass. And this is what the very large majority of Latin parishes follow, at least in the United States of America. I can't speak for other countries internationally. This ordinary form that we're talking about here came about after Vatican II. So this Vatican II changed a lot of the ways that the Mass was celebrated. So before Vatican II, we had the extraordinary form of the Mass, or it, as very commonly referred to as just being the Latin Mass. And since that was the language that this, extraordinary form is celebrated in, that's why it was called the Latin Mass. And at least locally to me, we still have multiple parishes that celebrate the Latin Mass. I think over time it's kind of grown again, but that was all we had before Vatican II. And now after Vatican II, we have this ordinary form. So to summarize, under the Latin Rite, you have the Roman Rite. And under that, you have the ordinary form of the Mass as well as the extraordinary form of the Mass. But you also have other rites. Such as the rites of maybe specific religious orders or groups. So, for example, I know the Dominicans have the Dominican Rite. And a lot of these, just to point out, really aren't that different. They're unique in their own way. But it's important, I think, to point out that you're not going to walk into a church that's going through the Dominican Rite and have zero clue what's going on as a Catholic. You would be pretty up to par on all of it, I would say. I imagine that a lot of this can get pretty confusing pretty quickly. So the way that I like to look at it, or at least the way that I like to look at the Latin liturgical family, is that the Latin Rite or the Latin tradition is kind of like just a huge family, right? And the Roman Rite could maybe be considered one of the main members of the family. So like a mom or a dad or something like that, right? With the other smaller and less used Latin rites existing as part of that family, but maybe not playing as much of a prominent role. So maybe think of them as like a cousin or something. So they're still a part of the family. They just hold a smaller role, if that, makes sense. Okay, so that's the Latin Rite. Now let's move to the West Syriac Rite. This was a liturgical rite that spread to the areas of Antioch and Jerusalem, right? So this is the one that I touched on briefly earlier in my example. And this would be places that are modern day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, etc. And since that area of the world is so large and there's such a wide range of cultures and people found there, both historically and currently, there were multiple particular churches that came from the West Syriac Rite. The Maronite Church, for example, falls under this rite, and it's actually one of the oldest churches in the world. From what I could find, this was the oldest particular church after, the Roman Church. And this church stems from around the 12th century. It may have came even from a little older than that, but some of that's foggy when you're reading through the history of it. And it has an incredibly rich history and incredibly rich traditions. And this particular church can actually be traced to Saint Maron, who was living in what is now modern day Syria. And then from him and from his followers, it spread through Lebanon and onto other areas as time went forward. I think today it's known most synonymously with Lebanon, but it's spread to a wide range of places. Then there is the Syriac Catholic Church. This has a long history as well, and this one kind of ebbed and flowed over time, but it was reestablished, if you will, brought back into the fold around the 1660s. And the reason for this particular church's formation is that there were groups of Syriac Orthodox Christians who wanted to reunite with Rome. So at some point they had been separated, they wanted to come back in full communion with Rome. And so when they did this, this church was formed. And then lastly, under the West Syriac Rite, there is the Syro-Malankar Catholic Church, which I'm guessing I'm butchering that, but I'm not sure. This was created kind of similarly, which is that members from the Malankar Orthodox Syrian Church entered full communion with Rome in India. So this one was located in the Indian region, and a lot of these individuals kind of were separating from the Malankar Orthodox Syrian Church and wanted to come back in full communion with Rome. And when they did so, this particular church was formed. All right, who's next? Let's see. Let's do the Alexandrian Rite, right? So as you're probably aware, Alexandria was, and still is, a very large and important city in Egypt. And as the name might imply, this liturgical rite was one that came from areas such as Egypt. But it also included other areas in northern Africa, specifically kind of like northeastern Africa, such as Ethiopia and Eritrea. And so these countries match pretty perfectly with the particular churches, as there's the Coptic Catholic Church stemming from Egypt, and that one dates back to around 1740. Then there is the Ethiopian Catholic Church, which was recognized in 1930. And then finally, the Eritrean Catholic Church, which is actually a very recent particular church dating from just 2015. And the reason for that is that pre-2015, the Eritrean population was a part of the Ethiopian Catholic Church, but the Holy See established an independent hierarchy for Catholics in Eritrea in 2015, thus leading to the formation of this particular church. The Armenian Rite only currently has one particular church which follows the rite, which is the Armenian Catholic Church. Surprising, I know, right? And this emerged around 1740, and it came about due to an effort of, how would you put it, reunification, maybe, between Armenian Christians and Rome. So again, similar to what we were talking about with the Ethiopian Catholic Church, etc. And so it was created, like a lot of these other particular churches that we're talking about, because the Armenians sought to unite themselves back with Rome. But they also wanted to preserve their ancient liturgy in classic Armenian, hence the reason why this particular church began in the first place, rather than those individuals just practicing some different liturgical rite. The East Syriac Rite is interesting because it originated in Mesopotamia, which is pretty awesome, and can be found today and back then in places like South India, Central and Inner Asia. And most interesting to me when I was reading through this, actually, is that it took root in Persia, or modern-day Iran, I should say. There are two particular churches that follow this rite, both of which can trace their roots back to the mid-1500s-ish, but one of which somewhat recently just regained its self-governing status, which I'll go into in just a second here. So the Chaldean Catholic Church was created when divisions within the Church of the East, so thinking kind of Orthodox Christianity, caused some members to elect a new bishop, who then entered into full communion with Rome. So this particular church is currently based out of Iraq, which is pretty cool, in the Middle East. So the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church, that's the other one that follows the East Syriac Rite, this is found primarily in modern-day India. And it actually can trace its origins all the way back to the evangelization and missionary efforts of the followers of St. Thomas the Apostle in the first century. So St. Thomas sent his followers out, his disciples, if you will, to spread the good news. And when they did, they spread it to India. And it didn't really get its official start, if you will, until sometime around the mid 1500s, right? So these missionary efforts began around the first century, but it wasn't really until the mid 1500s, specifically after the schism of 1552 in the Church of the East, um, that's when this really started to get officially organized and recognized. And this schism of 1552 of the Church of the East, this is actually the same situation as the Chaldean Catholic Church that we just discussed. That's why when I said, the Chaldean Catholic Church gets their roots back to like the mid 1500s, it's the same thing. It's the same schism that we're talking about here. So this particular church, we are talking about the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church now. Sorry, it's dense here, right? We're wading through. We're waiting. This particular church is the one that I was talking about earlier when I mentioned that one of them was kind of just recently regaining their self-governing status. And to make this incredibly long story as short as possible, there was a lot of internal strife and conflict within this particular church. So it wasn't really until about 1923 that it was actually fully recognized and unified with Rome. Last, but obviously certainly not least, is the Byzantine Rite. And this one has 15 different particular churches under it. As your eyes were glazing over as I was going through all of them earlier, I'm sure you remember that. Each of these 15, as you heard, is basically organized by their national identity. So you have things like the Albanian Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic Church, the Russian Catholic Church, etc. Right? So each of these churches arose mainly from reunion movements of Orthodox Christians with Rome. So there's kind of a common thread between all of these, is that for the most part, a lot of them had broken away from Rome. And as they came back and wanted to be reunited with Rome and become back in full communion with Rome, that's where a lot of these particular churches came from, including these under the Byzantine Rite. So there were often some form of formal agreements or kind of paperwork, if you will. So, for example, the Union of Brest. That is an example of a formal agreement that brought back some of these Orthodox Christian groups under the Byzantine Rite and gave them full communion back with Rome. So they maintain their Byzantine liturgy and their theology and their spirituality. And most of these particular churches can trace their origins back to anywhere from the 1400s to probably around the early 1900s at the latest. And many of them still actually have a very large amount of members even to this day. So, for example, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, they have over 4.4 million members, which maybe that doesn't sound like a ton when you compare it to the 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide, but you have to remember that this is just one particular church located in one very specific area of the world. So it's actually pretty awesome. Also, I would imagine whether you're a Roman Catholic or not even a Catholic at all, you could still probably recognize the particular churches that fall under the Byzantine Rite, primarily because they have such amazing iconography. So if you've ever seen a picture of an iconostasis before, you would know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't seen a picture of an iconostasis, I would recommend that you look it up. That's Iconostasis. These are these awesome like partitions that they use within some of these churches to separate the altar from other areas of the church. And more often than not, they are decked out. And I'm talking about beautiful imagery, gold inlay all over the place, just like tons of amazing stuff. And I just find them incredibly fascinating. And I can't help but wonder how well I would be able to focus on the Mass if my local parish had one of these, because they're just so awesome. So I would say check it out. There was one specifically that of course, I'm failing to remember the name of the church, but there was one in Russia that I was looking at that is incredible. It's huge. It's so tall. It's so massive. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. So anyway, because of their iconography, right, their symbols, their vestments, the way the clergy presents themselves, etc., I think a lot of people would be able to identify the Byzantine Rite, or at least particular churches that fall underneath it. And I've got to say that, both before and after going through all of these particular churches and liturgical rites, I had a lot of questions. I mean, shoot, I still have some questions, right? But a lot of the questions that I had didn't make a lot of sense now, like looking back. But I do feel like it's important to put these questions out there because I imagine there might be others like me who may have been wondering some of these same things, right? So, like I said in the intro, if the Catholic Church is supposed to be one universal church, then why do all these particular churches exist? Well, really, the simplest way to answer that is that although there are a large amount of these particular churches, and although they are self governing, they all are in full communion with Rome. And what that means is that they all share the same faith, the same sacraments, the same governance, the same rules, the same doctrine, the same sacramental life, everything with Rome. Therefore, in turn, they share that with each other as well. So, yes, there are plenty of differences between these churches, and we've already touched on some of them, but when it comes to the main parts of the faith, they actually don't differ at all. There's no differences. They are all still a part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that we reference. So, if someone was to ask, do all of these particular churches really follow and believe the same things? The answer would be yes. But what if I'm Roman Catholic, let's say, because I am, and my friend is Maronite Catholic? Can I still go to church with them and receive communion? Is it okay if I go, even though I'm not a part of that particular church or I don't follow that particular liturgical rite? Yes, you can. Because again, all Catholic churches, regardless of where they are in full communion with Rome. So any Catholic can attend any particular church and receive the Eucharist. Here's a question actually that a lot of people wonder about, and sometimes they even seem to take issue with to a degree, understandably so, right? Why do Eastern Catholics have married priests while the Latin Church, or maybe you'd say Western Catholics, don't? Well, the reality is that the discipline of celibacy, it differs by the tradition itself. So in the East, the ancient customs that they have permit married men to be ordained priests. That being said, bishops are actually only chosen from celibate monastics, so bishops are not married. The Latin Church developed the discipline of priestly celibacy over time. So in the beginning, it wasn't really a thing in the Latin Church, but then by the Middle Ages, it became much more strict and it was something that you saw much more often until where today it's everywhere, right? And the Latin Church values celibacy as a fuller sign of total dedication to Christ. So both practices, married, unmarried, they're both legitimate. Vatican II actually declared that Eastern churches, quote, have the right and duty to govern themselves according to their own disciplines, end quote. So it's one of those things where since these particular churches are self-governed, there isn't really a desire to be some sort of like heavy-handed mediator by the Holy See. Obviously, you want to make sure that everyone stays in full communion with Rome, but when it comes to the churches themselves, they have the right to govern themselves according to, their own principles and their own traditions. And so that's the reason why you see in Eastern Catholic churches oftentimes, or maybe not oftentimes, but sometimes the clergy is married, where in Western Catholic churches like the Roman Catholic Church, that just doesn't happen. Another question that came up was, will there one day be more particular churches? Are they still bringing new communities into the fold that will one day become their own particular church? And to be completely candid with you, I actually wasn't really able to find an answer on this, or at least not one that was very solid. My guess is that no, I don't believe that there are going to be very many more, if any, of these particular churches coming in the future. However, like I said, I couldn't really find a lot of good information about this. I imagine it might be possible, especially if there was a really large movement by some sort of ethnic group, but I don't know for sure. So that's one that I need to do more research into. But let's do one more. Are Eastern Catholics the same as Orthodox Christians? Well, they're actually very close. So they're not the same. Both Eastern Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, they share, pretty much the entire same liturgical traditions and sacraments. The difference is that Eastern Catholics are in full communion with the Pope of Rome, while the Orthodox churches are in partial communion. That's the way they kind of put it, right? So they have valid sacraments and they have valid apostolic succession, but they don't have a unity of governance with the Pope and the Vatican. So Vatican II actually recognized this closeness, calling the Orthodox Church, quote, sister churches, end quote. So it's a situation where they are incredibly similar. So remember how earlier I was talking about you would most likely recognize someone or a church that was following the Byzantine Rite? Part of that is because it's so similar to Eastern Orthodox Christians, which a lot of people have seen or had some sort of experiences with. And so a lot of the times, the way they dress, their liturgical practices, the iconography, the statues, the paintings, etc., are almost synonymous between Eastern Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. And so because of this, whether you're seeing an Eastern Orthodox Christian or you're seeing an Eastern Catholic, it might be difficult to differentiate between the two groups, but at least you will know kind of like, oh, they're from the East. They're probably either Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Christian. They're very, very similar. Maybe that's the best way to sum that up. But yeah, I mean, that kind of wraps it up. At least those were the most major questions that I had, or the ones that I came across. There's still a ton more out there, of course, but again, without a 5-hour episode, it would be hard to go into every single nook and cranny of each one of these. I'm hoping that I didn't bore you to death with this one. It's funny because some of these topics are so enthralling and interesting to me, and I get all hyped up, and I'm like, yes, let's do it. I get all energized, right? But then after the show, I take a step back, and especially when I'm like editing or re-listening before posting the episodes, I realize that for some people, this stuff is going to be like super boring. But I guess that really kind of comes down to one of the coolest parts about the Catholic faith, at least for me, which is that our faith is so deep, it's so historical, it's so complex, but it's also so accessible that it's something that you could spend literally your entire life studying and never even fully understand all of it. And funnily enough, some people really do spend their entire life studying the faith. Side note, actually, on a little bit of more of a personal side for me, but I'm actually going down this path of lifelong study myself, not only through this show, but also through additional study and reading and courses. And I've got some things in the work in regards to that, and I'll update here once those things begin to move forward. But either way, I hope at a minimum you learned something from this new episode, right? I'm hoping that you learned a little bit more about these particular churches or about, these liturgical rites. And that if someone asks you one day, like, hey, you're Roman Catholic, but this guy over here isn't. Are they actually Catholic? You can say, yeah, of course. And you can talk to them about it. And I'm happy that you were willing to join us today and give this episode a chance. So I really hope you'll consider joining us again on the next episode. Life has been hectic, to say the least, recently, but I have some really awesome shows in the pipeline over the next few weeks and month here. Some topics that I know many of you will be really interested in, so I'm very excited about that. Please know that every day when I sit with the Lord in prayer, I pray for all of you. I think of all of you that are listening to this show. And please always remember that God is calling you in his own special way to grow closer to him, experience his love, experience his mercy, experience his grace, right? Knock and the door shall be open. Seek and you shall find. Never forget to pray to figure out what way God is calling you in your life. Recently, I've started adding more rosaries into my prayer life as well, which I would highly recommend to anyone listening to this. And I'm dedicating many of those rosaries to the listeners of this show. So just know, you are being prayed for. You are being thought of. I'm your host, Michael Ryan. As always, may the Lord bless you and may he keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may he look upon you kindly and give you peace. Have a blessed day, everyone. And I will see all of you in the next episode.